On behalf of the Board of Trustees, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this evening's session of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. We'd like to thank the Knoxell Corporation, which is one of our charter corporate members, for giving special support to this evening's program. I'd also like to remind you that our guest a week from this evening, the 10th of June, will be the Ambassador of the Netherlands to the United States. And he'll be speaking on political aspects of the economic relationships between the United States and Europe. I'd also like to remind you that on that same evening preceding that meeting, at 4:45 p.m., we will hold our annual meeting at which trustees are elected and a short report is given on the status of the Council. Our topic tonight, as you know, is the foreign policy of the Republic of Turkey. Of course, the United States and Turkey have been good friends since the late 18th century. We signed a treaty in 1830, and our current close relations began with a signing of an agreement in July of 1947, which implemented what was a foundational part of American foreign policy, the Truman Doctrine, and which has been and will continue to be in the future an important aspect of that policy. Of course, Turkey has been a member of NATO. She has the second largest armed forces among the NATO nations. But her interests in foreign policy are not simply those of NATO and concerned with the Soviet Union. And regional interests, as most of you know, has complicated those relationships following the coup d'etat by Greek army officers in Cyprus, followed by Turkish troops being sent there to protect the Cypriot Turks, followed in turn by American discontent with the use of American military supplies in that particular conflict, followed then by certain modifications of our relations by the Turkish government, including the abrogation of our 1969 agreement with them. Following 6 years of some strain in our relations, as you know, since 1980, where an agreement was reached again on military and economic matters, American aid, both military and economic, has continued. So that the status of the relationship today, I think, can indeed be described as a close one. Turkey is strategically important to the United States, and we value her friendship, of course. We're delighted, therefore, that we're joined this evening by the Ambassador of the Republic of Turkey, who received his Bachelor of Science degree from the School of High Studies of Economy and Commerce in Istanbul, and his doctorate in economics from the University of Paris. He's been a member of the Foreign Affairs Service in his country since 1951. He's served in a variety of capacities. He's been served with the political section of the ministry. He's been stationed at the United Nations. He's been a trainee with the IMF in Washington. He's been a counselor to the Turkish delegation at NATO. At the same time, the Turkish representative to the Economic Committee and the representative at NATO for the Defense Planning Committee. He served as the Director General for the NATO Department within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was Assistant to the Secretary General for Political Military Affairs within the ministry. And in 1970 was appointed as Ambassador to Japan from the Republic of Turkey. He was then Deputy Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs during a very interesting period, 1974 to 1979, and then appointed Ambassador of his nation to the United States. It's my great pleasure and honor to welcome and to introduce to you His Excellency, the Ambassador of the Turkish Republic to the United States, Sukru, Elekdag.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a great pleasure and privilege for me to address this distinguished audience. On this occasion, I wish to express my thanks and appreciation to Mr. Frank Bird, Executive Director of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs, for so ably making all the arrangements for this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, your organization is in the forefront of an important and for me gratifying phenomenon in the United States. Throughout your country, I have detected during my travels a renewed awareness of international relationships. Much of the credit for this must go to the work of your organization and others like it in the cities across the United States. I greatly appreciate this increasing interest in international politics, since it gives me and also to my colleagues to address audiences like yours. No doubt, organizations like yours contribute to international understanding and communication. Communication and building bridges are also the main tasks of an ambassador. But in that respect, ambassadors face certain difficulties. Let me explain. The famous American poet, Robert Frost, described a diplomat in the following way. He said, "A diplomat is a man who always remembers a lady's birthday, but never remembers her age." So probably Robert Frost by this wanted to say that diplomats, ambassadors, normally accentuate the positive and neglect perhaps a little bit the less positive aspects of the things. However, in some people's eyes, little has changed in the 3 centuries since Sir Henry Walden defined an ambassador in the following way. Sir Walden said, "An ambassador is an honest man sent abroad to lie for the good of his country." In a similar vein, the late Adlai Stevenson, who was once the presidential candidate, said, "An ambassador's life is made up of 3 ingredients: protocol, geritol, and alcohol." Probably Mr. Stevenson was influenced by the now famous instructions Emperor Napoleon gave to his ambassadors serving abroad. He told them, "Keep a good table and take good care of the ladies," whatever he meant. But let me tell you that Prime Minister Özal expects a great deal more from me. It is customary, ladies and gentlemen, that in large capital cities, ambassadors complain about the burdens imposed on them by the social life. Endless receptions, cocktail parties, dinners, and so on and so forth, which are an integral part of diplomatic existence. So 3 decades ago, an English ambassador who was representing his country in Paris described his job in the following way. He said, "It is easy on the head, but hell on the feet." But believe me, in Washington, D.C., it is hard on both. In my remarks this evening, I would like to elaborate on Turkey's place in the Western world, her contribution to Western defense, the state of Turkish-American relations, and Turkey's future prospects. But first, very briefly, allow me to describe to you the state of affairs in Turkey. Now, the Financial Times of London, in an article published in its May 20 issue, states that, and I quote, "A vigorous and dynamic society has been created in Turkey in the last 8 years. The achievement of this period have transformed a country once paralyzed by political extremism and prostrate before its creditors into a remarkably dynamic society where the quality of life and ideas seems to be constantly improving." End of quotation. The Financial Times further states, and I quote, "Turkey will be transformed by the 1990s into a bustling, newly industrialized society with even higher growth rates than 5% or 8% GNP increases of the past few years." End of quotation. The Özal government, which came to power through the elections held in 1983, is dealing with economic challenges confronting Turkey in a very inventive fashion. And actually, Turkey's economic policies are being praised by international banking and financial circles, and Turkey's policies are being shown as a model to be emulated by other semi-industrial or developing countries. The Özal government is transforming Turkey from an inward-looking, state-directed and regulated economy to one committed to free enterprise, private initiative, outward orientation, and growth through international trade, investment, and competition. In the past 5 years, Turkey's exports have tripled. And the fact that the share of industrial products in Turkey's total exports increased to 75% of her total exports is very significant. This reflects our growing industrial base as well as the level of competitive strength in world markets that Turkish industry has reached. During last years, Turkey had the highest GNP growth rates among the European and Western countries, among the OECD countries, in other words. 1986 growth rate was 8%. Turkey ranks higher in most economic categories than is generally realized. Turkey is a large domestic market comprising 52 million citizens in a land 3 times the size of West Germany. Turkey has the 25th largest economy in the world. Turkey is one of the 7 countries in the world which are self-sufficient in food and have exportable surpluses. Turkey is actually the breadbasket of the Middle East. And Turkish industry is reaching out. Today there are 200 Turkish engineering and contracting firms doing business in North Africa, in Arabic Peninsula, in Southwest Asian countries. Turkish engineering firms in all these countries, using Turkish materials and labor, are building cement factories, sugar factories, pharmaceutical plants, foundries, refineries, housing complexes, roads, harbors, etc., etc. At the end of 1985, the amount of work that the Turkish companies operating abroad had was about $16.5 billion. Because of the contraction of the Middle Eastern market, recently, due to the decline of oil price, Turkish contracting and engineering firms turned their eyes to the Far East and also to the North for new markets. Presently, at least 8 groups of contractors are preparing tenders for numerous projects involving hotels, hospitals, tourism development centers, and other public works in Moscow, Yalta, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. What I said doesn't mean that the Turkish economy is totally out of the woods and has solved all its major problems. Indeed, the economy still faces many challenges. We still have Sisyphean problems to surmount. But one thing is certain, and that is that Turkey today is a vigorous and dynamic society, steaming at full speed and with confidence to a rendezvous with Europe. A partnership with Europe inside the European Economic Community appears to Turkish industrialists and political leaders as the natural way forward at this point. The Özal government recently applied to the European Economic Community for full membership. Integration with the European Community, although would necessitate radical transformations in Turkey, would also accelerate and consolidate the sweeping changes already taking place in the country. Now I will elaborate on the Turkish-American relations. From the historical and the geopolitical perspective, these relations could only be described as a positive and constructive alliance and partnership. Initially, our ties were based on one dimension. This dimension was the strong strategic interdependence established between our countries by the geography and geopolitics. But now, with Turkey's democratic institutions sinking deeper roots and the trade and economic relations between Turkey and the United States growing steadily, a new fabric of mutual interests and bonds are being woven between our nations. The fact that our bonds are progressing toward a three-dimensional, meaning strategic, democratic, and economic relationship is very encouraging. However, I should tell you that recently some alarming developments have occurred in our relations. But before dwelling on them, I think I should first elaborate on Turkey's critically important contribution to Western defense and to United States security. This contribution stems from three elements: Turkey's strategic and military value, her political commitment, and the moral fiber and strength of the Turkish people. Turkey is quite literally a gateway between three continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. All the important routes, air, sea, and land, between the important strategic areas of the three continents lead across Turkey, making Turkey a strategic hub of worldwide significance. Turkey's strategic and military importance proceeds from the following facts. First, Turkey is the only NATO country which has common boundaries with the Soviet Union. Turkey has 300 miles land border with the Soviet Union in the Caucasian area and has 1,100 miles maritime boundaries in the Black Sea with the Soviet Union. The Black Sea is shown as an enclosed sea, and has 150 miles boundaries with Bulgaria. The other NATO country, which has common boundaries with the Soviet Union, the only other NATO country, is Norway. And in North Cap here, Norway has 12 miles common boundaries with the Soviet Union. But this area is covered with ice and snow 10 months a year. So it is not available for military operations. Turkey guards the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, which are the only seaway for the huge Soviet Black Sea Navy in the Black Sea to sail into the Mediterranean. Now, Soviets have three navies. One is in Murmansk for the Atlantic, the other is in Vladivostok for the Pacific, and the third navy that they have is in the Black Sea. And this Black Sea Navy comprises 1/3 of all their combatants. If, in case of a major NATO war, this Soviet fleet could sail into the Mediterranean, then it will constitute a devastating force vis-à-vis the US Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean. Now, why the Mediterranean is so important? The Mediterranean is a strategic avenue without which the defense of Europe is not possible. Europe, as you can see, does not have the width and the depth for a secure balance, secure defense. So it needs North African littoral for reserves and for also military operational equipment. And as you will remember that in the Second World War, the Allied landings in Europe could start only after full control of the Mediterranean. So if we say that the defense of Europe starts from the Turkish Straits, this is not going to be any exaggeration. Turkey, by virtue of her disciplined army and her strategic position, acts as an insulator between the communist world and the Arabic Peninsula and the Persian Gulf area. If this barrier were to be removed or bypassed by the Warsaw Pact, the Warsaw Pact countries would have direct access to the petroleum-producing areas in the Arabian Peninsula. There is no question that such a development would have most grave consequences and would change the balance of forces not only in this area, in the area of the Middle East, but also in Europe, and indeed in the world. Turkey's armed forces, comprising 820,000 active duty troops, is the largest army in NATO after that of the United States. According to statements made at the United States Congress, Turkish armed forces are engaging 45 Soviet and Warsaw Pact divisions in this area. Imagine how dramatically the imbalance of forces in Western Europe would be worsened if a sizable portion of these 45 divisions engaged by the Turkish armed forces were released for duty elsewhere. It should be noted here that Turkey's 820,000 active duty force are a force as large as the Greek, British, Portuguese, Danish, Norwegian, Dutch, and Canadian forces combined. Now, I will mention to you a situation which indicates very dramatically Turkey's contribution to the NATO defense. The NATO front with the Warsaw Pact extends from the North Cape in Norway to Mount Ara in eastern Turkey for 3,600 miles. North Cape, Norway, to eastern part of Turkey, 3,600 miles. The United States has 15 allies in Europe, but Turkey alone defends 1/3 of NATO front with the Warsaw Pact. As I said, this indicates in a very dramatic way, and in a very graphic way also, the military duties and responsibilities that Turkey has assumed in the NATO alliance. According to the 1980 Defense and Economic Cooperation Agreement between Turkey and the United States, which is a basic legal agreement complementing the NATO treaty, United States military personnel under Turkish command and control operate electronic intelligence gathering stations in Turkey. Former Secretary of State for Defense Brown stated in congressional hearings that these stations are indispensable to the United States security since they enable the West to monitor Soviet nuclear tests, experiments, and deployments, troop movements, and other developments in detail. They also provide strategic nuclear warning to the United States and early warning to the Sixth Fleet. Alexander Haig, the former Secretary of State, and former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General David Jones, characterized the intelligence data collected from monitoring sites, and I quote, as irreplaceable and critical, often unique. A publication of the Center for Strategic and International Studies indicates that 40 up to 50% of the electronic surveillance data on the Soviet Union is obtained through monitoring systems in Turkey. It is clear from all these factors that Turkey's contribution to Western defense and to United States security is indeed invaluable and irreplaceable, as described by General Haig. The military duties and responsibilities which Turkey addresses according to the defense plans of the NATO alliance are extensive and crucial. As I had explained to you a little while ago, Turkish-American cooperation and friendship, which was initially based on this vitally important strategic interdependence, recently has also flourished in many other areas. Our economic and trade relations are increasing each day. American banks and financial institutions have great interest in Turkey. And there is also American investment to Turkey in the field of agro-industry, machine tool, and many other areas. Currently, intensive negotiations are underway with U.S. firms with a view to establishing joint defense-related industries in Turkey. But I have to tell you that, unfortunately, recently some alarming developments occurred in our relations. Let me explain this to you through an article which had been published only a few days ago on June 1st in the New York Times. The title of the article is "A Myopic Approach to Ties with Turkey." The article indicates that these ties are going through a period of noticeable malaise due to certain unjust and unwarranted actions of the U.S. Congress vis-à-vis Turkey. The article in the New York Times, written by Joyce Starr from the Center of Strategic and International Studies, and General Edward Meyer, former Army Chief of Staff, stresses, and I quote, "The United States approach to Turkey long has been short-sighted and damaging to American economic and security interests, but never more so than today. Unless we are prepared to lose a close ally, we should reconsider these policies." These are not my words. Well, this statement may surprise many of you, since until recently, these relations appeared to be excellent and steadily widening and deepening. In fact, about 4 months ago, Prime Minister Özal paid a visit to the United States. He met with President Reagan, and they both emphasized that the Turkish-American alliance and partnership are the key elements of the strength and security of each. These are their words. President Reagan also stressed that Turkey stands as a beacon in a vitally important geopolitical area, as a friendly nation committed to Western values of democracy and open and accountable government. At that time, the U.S. administration did not fail to stress that the Turkish economic model had become a roadmap for many other semi-industrial countries. And this meeting was followed by an auspicious development. Secretary of State Schultz and Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs signed on the 16th of March a side letter for the Defense and Economic Cooperation Agreement that I mentioned to you a little while ago. This is an agreement which had been signed in 1980 and terminated at the end of 1985. So through this signature of the side letter, the 1980 agreement was extended for another 5 years until the end of 1990. Under the provisions of the side letter that has been signed on the 16th of March, 2.5 months ago, the United States solemnly undertook, and I quote, to propose to the United States Congress a high level of support for Turkey based on mutually agreed recommendations and commensurate with Turkey's important contribution to common defense, and to pursue the realization of this request with vigor and determination, no less than it accords to any assistance request. End of quotation. This is one of the provisions of the side letter. Furthermore, the United States has also committed to oppose vigorously inappropriate actions which would be harmful to U.S.-Turkish relations, such as the so-called 7-to-10 ratio. As you know, this is a formula supported by certain segments of the United States Congress, which guarantees Greece $7 for every $10 in United States military assistance to Turkey. Moreover, under the side letter, the United States undertook to do its utmost to prevent the linkage of security assistance to matters unrelated to our bilateral relations and the resolution endorsing Armenian allegations. As Turkish-American relations were progressing along this commendable course, suddenly alarming developments have occurred. And Turkey is not responsible for these developments. During the debates on the security assistance at the Congress, the amounts requested for Turkey by the administration were subjected to devastating cuts, thereby undermining Turkey's NATO mission capabilities and the viability of many existing armed forces modernization projects. Now, you may say that this is because of the budget deficit in the United States. Well, it is not accurate to attribute this development to Graham-Rudman budget pressures. As it has been expressed cogently in a recent editorial in the Wall Street Journal, editorial which had been published in the March 31st issue of the Wall Street Journal. It is said, and I quote, Congress, which has earmarked foreign aid for Israel and Egypt, has balked on Turkish aid because of pressures from the Greek lobby. It insists on the notorious 7-to-10 ratio, requiring $7 of aid to Greece for every $10 given to Turkey, end of quotation. This has been expressed in the Wall Street Journal in an editorial. This outcome was also entailed by the inability of the administration to put in the Congress the necessary counterweight to neutralize the anti-Turkish bias. This failure of the administration became conspicuous when it deployed a sustained and vigorous effort to overcome the strong lobbies determined to reduce military aid to Pakistan, and succeeded in maintaining the administration's request intact. But this is not all. At the same time, Congress has added insult to the injury by linking military assistance to Cyprus. A move, the practical effect of which would be to make the resolution of the Cyprus problem more difficult by rewarding intransigence. Now, while most of these negative developments may pass unnoticed in the United States media, they caused widespread and deep-rooted resentment and reaction in the Turkish press and body politic and among the broad Turkish public. The Turkish press regards these developments as a failure of the United States to fulfill the pledges it undertook regarding security assistance through an agreement, the ink of which is barely dried. At least in its eyes, as grave is the 7-to-10 ratio, which places United States-Turkish relations hostage to the policies of a third party, namely Greece. Likewise, the linkage of United States military assistance to the Cyprus issue is reminiscent of the mid-70s period during which trust and cooperation between our countries were shattered. I would like to give you objective views. This is why I would like to read to you here Flora Lewis's, who is a syndicated columnist, Flora Lewis's recent article in the New York Times. Because it sheds light on the reasons of the strong adverse reaction in Turkey. And I quote from Flora Lewis: Mr. Papandreou has regularly exacerbated Greece's troubles with NATO, promoting the view that the real threat to Greece comes not from the Soviet bloc, but from alliance member Turkey. He has flirted with threats to shut down American bases in Greece, primarily to win more concessions from the United States in the balance of arms that it supplies to both Greece and Turkey. End of quotation. Flora Lewis continues in the following way, and I quote: last week, he threatened war with Turkey over the issue of a Turkish oil exploration ship preparing to sail to waters between Greek islands and the nearby Turkish coast. Mr. Papandreou seems to think he can maintain, control, and manipulate the fevered public opinion he deliberately fans, which is a very dangerous game. No doubt the Prime Minister is relying on the vocal and effective lobby in this country to save him from the consequences of his bravura. End of quotation. The article had been published in the March 30 issue of the New York Times. Well, under these circumstances, on April 11, 1987, Turkish authorities, following an assessment made under the leadership of Prime Minister Turgut Özal, concluded that the side letter to the Defense and Economic Cooperation Agreement would not be taken up for ratification until the final outcome of congressional action is known. And now we expect the administration to do its utmost to live up to the agreement solemnly undertaken. Now, allow me to turn to a positive and encouraging aspect of our relationship. As I was saying a little while ago, until recently, our ties were based only on the strategic interdependence and the military cooperation between our countries. Consequently, our cooperation deriving from NATO, partnership, and bilateral security arrangements occupied the center stage of our relationship. But now, with Turkey's democratic institutions sinking deep roots and gaining strength each day, the ties between our societies multiply and reinforce each other. I'm also pleased to observe that trade and economic relations between Turkey and the United States are growing, and thus a new fabric of mutual interests and bonds are being woven between our nations. Until recently, the center stage of our relationship was mainly occupied by official representatives of our two governments discussing military matters, foreign aid, or economic assistance. Now, there are additional players on the stage who are coming to the forefront. These are the Turkish and American businessmen, investors, bankers, industrialists. This is a very favorable development which reflects a trend leading to a more balanced and diversified partnership. The fact that our bonds are progressing toward a three-dimensional strategic, economic, and democratic, as I said, is very encouraging. It is my firm belief that to the extent our business and investment relations will increase, the fabric of our mutual interest will become stronger and healthier and less vulnerable to the influence of ethnic lobbies. Before concluding, let me tell you that Turkey and the United States have similar strategic orientations, see eye to eye regarding most of the major world issues, share the same democratic ideals, and possess a large array of common interests. As such, our two countries' relations are based on strong foundations. But unfortunately, Turkish-US common interests are from time to time harassed by ethnic politics and cavalierly treated at the US Congress. Thoughtful Americans have lamented to the extent that the administration may be inhibited by the lobby's political weight and may fail to neutralize the hostile moves of the lobby. We have to expect the destabilization of our relationship. Turkey's dilemma is the following. On one hand, Turkish Americans in this country are not numerous enough to be represented in the United States Congress or to form vocal lobbying groups to neutralize the harmful effects of ethnic politics on Turkish-American relations. On the other hand, the administration, which values highly the Turkish-American relationship, too often appears reticent at the very time when the United States' interest in the relationship requires most vigorous advocacy. Apparently, the weight of ethnic political calculations takes a heavy toll, even in the administration. People are telling me about the importance of effective lobbying to safeguard Turkish-American interests. But frankly speaking, the most effective guardians and proponents of strong Turkish-American relations are enlightened citizens like yourself. If such proponents who know what is at stake fail to make their voices heard, what chance is there that our common interest will not be undermined by single-issue pressure groups? Thank you.
Your Excellency, we certainly thank you for what was a very thorough, systematic, and clear presentation, not only of your interests and our shared interests, but of your deep concerns as well. The floor will be open for questions until 10 minutes after 7. Yes, ma'am. There's a microphone just behind you if you'd like to use it.
Would His Excellency please comment on human rights and freedom of the press in Turkey?
Well, I can tell you one thing. Freedom of press in Turkey is well established. You just have to get one of the Turkish newspapers and look at it. They recognize no boundary for criticism. Freedom of press in Turkey is well established, and there isn't any kind of pressure on the Turkish press. This is for sure. And knowingly and honestly, nobody can say that there is some kind of restrictions and restraint on the Turkish press. Now, as regards human rights, Turkey today is a totally free country, and their Turkish citizens' human rights, all kind of rights, are protected under law. There are, from certain quarters, certain kind of accusations, but they're normally coming from either liberal ideologues or from socialist and communist centers in Europe. You have to go to Turkey to see that we have no human rights problem in Turkey.
Gentleman at the microphone.
Thank you. Thank you for coming to address us, and I have two diverging questions. The first, you touched on the problem of Cyprus. I'm wondering, it's been over 10 years now since Turkey more or less de facto divided the island, and I'm wondering what the progress is on settling that, or if in fact Turkey may someday annex that part of Cyprus. And my second question is different. I'm wondering, what is Turkey's position in the Iran-Iraq crisis, and what effect has the Ayatollah Khomeini's brand of fundamentalist Islam had effect on the secularist Turkish society?
Thank you. Well, let me answer first your question on Cyprus. Well, I'm sure that many of you know how the Cyprus question emerged. In 1974, the Greek junta, the Greek government in Greece, engineered a coup on the island to oust and to assassinate the then president of the Cypriot Republic, Archbishop Makarios, and to annex the island to Greece. The junta at that time, after 7 years of rule, thought that to maintain their rule on Greece, they needed a certain kind of victory. And this victory could only be achieved through the annexation of Cyprus to Greece. So they have done a very foolish thing. Through the troops that they had in Cyprus and through the Greek officers that they had on the island, they engineered the coup to assassinate Archbishop Makarios. The Archbishop fled the island. On the 19th of June, came to New York and spoke at the United Nations. And he said there, my country is invaded, not by the Turks, but by the Greeks. These are on the records of the United Nations. They are said by the late Archbishop Makarios. Turkey, under the Treaty of Guarantee, which was signed by Greece, Turkey, and Great Britain, wanted to take some measures to prevent the annexation of the island to Greece. The Turkish Prime Minister then, Mr. Ecevit, flew to London. At that time, the British Prime Minister was Mr. Callaghan. And he was struggling with great economic problems. He said to Mr. Ecevit, I cannot do anything to help you. Then, to save the lives of the Turkish Cypriots, and also to maintain the constitution of the Cypriot Republic, Turkey sent troops to the island. And since then, there are two zones on the island. In the northern part, the Turks have control, the Turkish Cypriots, and in the northern part, the Greek Cypriots. Now, the United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Perez de Cuellar, who knows the Cyprus issue very well, wanted to solve this problem. And after long consultations with the Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots, came forth with a draft agreement. The draft agreement visualized the establishment of a federal state on the island, a federal state under the roof of which there will be two federated states, Greek Cypriot, Turkish Cypriot, but there will be one state, in reality federal state, and these two federated states will cooperate with each other. He established the mechanism of the system and came forth with this proposal to both parties. The Turkish Cypriot leader, Mr. Denktash, made extraordinary concessions and accepted this draft agreement, whereas Mr. Cipriano did not accept it. So this agreement is still on the table. And it is not the Turkish Cypriot side which is dragging his feet, but the Greek Cypriot side. So this should be known. We, Turkey, wishes to see this problem to be solved. Because this is a problem, and we would like very much to establish good, friendly, and cooperative relationship with Greece. We want this problem to be solved. But unfortunately, we're not getting from the other side the necessary, the requisite goodwill. Now, as regards the situation in the Gulf, first, let me tell you Turkey's position. As you know, we have common boundaries with both Iran and Iraq, and fairly long boundaries here. We have close relations with both countries, but we're neutral. And we're sticking to the rules of neutrality very stringently. We're selling them all kinds of goods, except strategic goods and military equipment and material. We're at the proper time, we have indicated to both sides that we're ready to help to mediate or bring the two parties together, but we understand that for the time being, there isn't any such situation. Iran appears to be determined to continue the war. That responds your questions?
I also was interested in what the effect of Khomeini's fundamentalist Islamists had on the Turkish secular society.
Oh, yes.
From this point on, we'll limit the questions to one, however. Please.
Yes, sir. Now, Turkey and Iran are geographically very close to each other. But from the social and political point of view, they are worlds apart. In Turkey, we have today a secular society. And secularism is well instilled in the minds of the Turkish people. During the last 6 decades, since the establishment of the Turkish Republic, Turkish people have learned to reconcile their inner faith with the necessities of the modern life. Therefore, Iran's Islamic fundamentalism does not have any threatening effect on Turkey. But we know that we have to be vigilant. Our president, Evren, has made many statements in that respect. And he all the time recommends vigilance to the Turkish government and to the Turkish people on that respect. But the Turkish government on many statements indicated that they don't see any kind of danger coming from Khomeini's fundamentalism Turkey. And in fact, we have a fundamentalist political party in Turkey. It is called Refah Partisi, Prosperity Party, which during the last elections got only 7% of the total votes cast. So the clientele in Turkey of the fundamentalist parties, I think, fluctuates between 7% and 10% of the total votes cast. But recognize that we have to be vigilant. Thank you.
Next question's on the side. Did the audience hear the question? The question was prefaced by a comment upon, one, the solid nature of the American-Turkish alliance, but then prefaced secondly by the comment that there are 15,000 political prisoners in Turkey. Some, it was asserted, without trial for 5 years. The question for the ambassador was, would he comment upon the status of those political prisoners, and specifically, I believe it's Ali Turkit.
Ali Turkit. Yes, sir. I will answer your question. Now, I'm not going to hide myself behind the good relationship, between Turkey and the United States, or our strategic interdependence. But let me explain to you certain things. Number one, there are no political prisoners in Turkey. If there are prisoners today in the Turkish jails, these are people who have robbed the banks, robbed people, or killed or tried to kill the other people because of their political ideology. Let me explain. Let me give you a background first. Since the establishment of the Turkish Republic in 1923, we had 3 Turkish constitutions. All these 3 Turkish constitutions ban in Turkey the establishment of political parties based on Islamic fundamentalism or communism. And we have a penal law that we had adopted from the Italian and other European penal laws in the beginning of 1930s. And again, this penal law prohibits and penalizes the militant propagation of communism and militant propagation of Islamic fundamentalism. This is going on for the last 60 years. Turkey is a country surrounded by 6 states. In the north we have the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, and then we are surrounded by Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Greece. As you can see, this is a very interesting neighborhood. From the north, there have been always the cold winds of communism. From the south, there are always the hot winds of Islamic fundamentalism and Sharia. So we had to protect our democracy from devouring itself. We had to take certain decisions and establish certain principles and laws. For obvious reasons, we had this law. So in Turkey, if somebody tries to propagate militantly religion or communism, he goes in jail. This is in our constitution. These are in our penal laws. And this is going to be continued until the Turkish people changes the constitution and these laws. For the time being, they are supporting it. Let me continue. Our 1960 constitution was a very liberal constitution. And benefiting from this constitution in Turkey, there have been many actions. And in the 70s, Turkey went through a very difficult period. There was chaos in Turkey. There was political violence, assassinations. We're not going to allow this to happen again. And some of the people at that time who were killing the other people because of their political ideas, each day 20 people were killed in 1978 and 79. So these culprits have been in jail. But they're not held there incommunicado. They've been tried. Sometimes the trials are never long. You see that also in your country, the same thing. Because you have to investigate. And the investigations sometimes take a long time. But many of these prisoners also, walked out. I should tell you this. So where there is democracy, there is human right. Where there is democracy, there is the right to redress. We are maintaining our democracy. We may have, not everything will be perfect in Turkey probably, as in other states, but the only way to correct the wrongs is the belief and the faith in democracy. And for the protection of democracy, for safeguarding democracy, and for preventing democracy to devour itself, especially in a country like Turkey, you have to take, for the good of the public, certain steps. Thank you.
At the microphone,
yes.
Please.
From the perspective that it is probably a good thing to have as much cultural and commercial intercourse between nations as possible, and that we in the United States know probably much less about the Muslim culture and behavior than we do about so many others. Are there any significant problems or inhibitions growing out of the Muslim culture relative to what we have come to know in the West as Western liberal capitalism? For example, we hear things about the payment of interest, and are foreign nationals, will they find churches of denominations other than Muslim throughout Turkey, and things like that? What's it like doing business in Turkey?
Well, if you go to any major Turkish city, you will see that the life is like in any other major European city. During last years, American financial institutions moved in Turkey one after the other. The big giants, like Chase Manhattan Bank, Boston First National Bank, and many others. So probably they think that there is lucrative business in Turkey. And as regards the interest rate in Turkey, I think that the normal economic systems in the world are being implemented. But I know that within the Islamic Conference, there had been certain tendencies, and with capital coming from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, an Islamic bank also was established in Turkey, which functions not on interest, but I think, on profits, this kind of thing. I'm not very much aware, though, how that it functions, because there is only one exceptional bank like this. So, in other words, business in Turkey is like business in Italy or in Denmark or in any other kind of European country. And we have good managers, I should tell you. They speak business. They are intelligent, inventive, and very, I should say, aggressive people.
We have time for only one last question at the microphone, please.
This is a somewhat more general question, but I'm interested in the country's internal economic policy, economic development policy, if there is one, other than what you've stated already about agricultural development, particularly if there's an urban-rural policy and if there are any kind of development goals that the company has. Is that too general for you to try to answer?
No, I think that I can answer you briefly. Number one, until about 1980, Turkey was an inward-looking country. Turkey's industrial and economic development was based on the principle of import substitution. In other words, when there is a need for a certain material in Turkey, this material had been manufactured in Turkey, but the importation of it had been prohibited. Through these policies, there had been industrialization in Turkey, and a fairly structured industry had been established. But after 1960, as these policies created many white elephants in Turkey, meaning many industrial structures which produce everything that the people needs, but don't have any competitive strength. Because of this, Turkey wanted to change these policies, but in 1970s, as I explained a little while ago, we had many problems. Internal problems, domestic problems, political violence, coalition governments coming one after the other, and which couldn't take the necessary, adopt the necessary policies. In 1980, we have initiated different policies. Particularly after the election of Mr. Özal, these policies have been expanded. And we started to implement what we call an export-led development model. Meaning that things in Turkey, and at the same time, we have started a liberalization program. We opened up Turkey to the outside world. Until 1980, when we were implementing this policy of import substitution, we had erected protectionist walls around Turkey. And everything in Turkey was regulated. So what we have done, starting 1980, was deregulation. We freed the market forces. We dismantled all these walls, protectionist walls erected around Turkey. We have liberalized imports and exports. And it is in these circumstances that Turkey increased its exports. And there was an extraordinary, as I mentioned a little while ago, increase in Turkish exports. That indicates Turkish competitive strength. So today we have these liberal policies. We are in Europe among the countries which have less protectionism, and also we are giving much more importance to develop industries in Turkey for export purposes. But also our policies have a social dimension. We are also spending a fairly large amount of money for housing and for other social needs. So I should tell you one thing, that for a country which for 50 years had a protected economy, an isolated economy, which had price controls on each and everything, which is a totally regulated economy, for this country to resort to deregulation, to resort to an outward policies, to dismantle all these walls surrounding the country, is a revolution, really. But so far, for Turkey, it worked. I hope it will work also in the future.
Mr. Ambassador, we must thank you for your very full and informative answers. And further, let me just make one comment, and that is at the beginning of your remarks, you referred to the councils such as this around the nation who participate in this kind of activity. And we fully appreciate the fact that the largest subsidy and the most sturdy support of councils like this around the country come from people like yourself who are willing to believe that the activity is constructive and that and you're so willing to share your time with us. We thank you very, very much for that.
Thank you very much.